Let's experiment with an interesting approach to retirement planning that borrows from one of history's greatest problem solvers. Most of us ask ourselves, what does success look like and how can I achieve it? But what if instead we asked, what does failure look like and how can we avoid it? Let's identify all the risks we might face or ways we might fail, and only then decide the positive actions we should take to mitigate those risks.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, where we believe Benjamin Franklin's advice that an investment in knowledge pays the best interest, both in finances and in your life. Every episode teaches you personal finance and long-term investing in simple terms. Now, here's your host, Jesse Kramer.
Welcome to Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, episode 140. I'm Jesse Kramer. I'm a financial planner working with retirees and busy professionals prepping for retirement across the USA. You can learn more at planwithjesse.com. This week's review of the week is from Steve Stewart, who left kind words and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Steve, drop me an email to jesse@bestinterest.blog, and I'll get a super soft podcast t-shirt mailed out to you. Now on with the show. I was listening recently to one of Charlie Munger's famous parables, probably the 10th time I've heard him tell the same story. Charlie dropped out of Michigan to serve in World War II, and he entered the Army Air Corps, which was the predecessor to the U.S. Air Force. And with Munger's math background, he was a math major at Michigan, he was sent out to Caltech in California to learn how to be a weather forecaster for the Army. Now, working for the Army Air Corps, he famously thought to himself, how can I kill these pilots? Yes, how can I kill these pilots? He kind of turned the problem on its head, and he came to two overwhelmingly strong conclusions. The most accidental yet obvious ways that he could get pilots into trouble were by either one, sending them too far afield, kind of against the wind, such that they would actually run out of fuel before returning back home. And then number two was sending them into cold and wet and icy conditions such that ice would build up on their wings, it would weigh down the planes and cause them to crash. So those were the two most obvious and most common death mechanisms that Munger identified. And he then became fanatic about reverse engineering the best practices to ensure that he helped his pilots avoid those two fates. You might have heard me discuss Charlie Munger's principle of inversion. This is the principle of inversion that we're talking about. You might have heard me discuss it before, but we're going to double down on the principle of inversion today. I'm going to walk you through the most common ways retirees and long-term investors can fail at achieving their goals. We'll identify the biggest risks they face and the most obvious failure points along the way. And then, only after thinking about how we can get ourselves into the biggest trouble, will we invert our issues and find the smart solutions. So first, my thought was, let's identify these risks that we're going to be talking about today. And I should say before we go any further, today's going to be part one because I've got a list of 14 risks and we're going to dive into them with some detail. We're going to cover the first 7 risks today on episode 140. We're going to cover the second set of 7 risks next week on episode 141. So let's first compile this master list of the 14 risks that retirees and long-term investors face. And I'll do just a really quick description before diving into more detail. So number 1, longevity risk. I think it's probably the biggest, most obvious risk that I can think of when it comes to retirement. It's the risk that you live so long that you run out of money, that you've only built a retirement plan assuming you'd live until 75 or 80, and then you end up living till 95. That's longevity risk. Number 2 is inflation risk, which a lot of these risks are going to be interconnected in some way, and inflation risk certainly has a connection to longevity risk, but inflation risk is this ever-present and kind of modern economy's risk, meaning that today's dollar is going to lose spending power over time. And combined with living longer than expected, inflation risk means our current dollars simply won't go far enough into the future. That is inflation risk. And number 3, I call it partner risk or household risk or stakeholder risk, maybe partner risk for short. And the idea is, are you and your spouse or you and your kids or you and whomever is important in your life, are you guys on the same page? Could disagreements throw off your plan, your financial plan in some way? Or could an untimely death, the death of a partner, throw off your plan in some way? So basically the idea is how contingent is your plan on the other people in your life? And is that a risk? That is partner risk. Number 4, market risk, and just kind of in general, market risk. The idea here is that investments can go down in value, meaning that there is a risk that investments actually hurt your plan more than they help your plan. That's market risk. And then 5th is a specific type of market risk that we've heard many times on this podcast before, I know, sequence of returns risk. That's number 5. It's a particular market risk. Even if your investments go up over the long run, if they go down too early in your retirement, it can create this chain reaction that you never actually recover from. That is sequence of returns risk, number 5. Number 6, withdrawal risk. Your cash flow needs are too much for your portfolio, and you're simply withdrawing too much too quickly. That's withdrawal risk. Number 7, I have as health risk. And again, it's a general risk. Will you find yourself at 70 years old, too weak or too sick to, hop on a plane, to play with your grandkids, to live whatever version of an active retirement that you've been hoping for? That is health risk, number 7. Number 8, I call shock spending risk. But most specifically, I think of it as long-term care risk. It's the care of this sudden, unforeseen, extremely large spending need. So these kind of unforeseen large expenses are one of the biggest derailers of a retirement plan. One of the most common culprits happens to be long-term care, which often costs more than $10,000 per month for multiple years at a time. So that's the 8th risk, shock spending / long-term care risk. Number 9, cognitive decline risk. It's related to health risk in general. It's also related to behavioral risk, which we'll talk about next. But the idea here is that cognitive decline, sure, it's got its own health risks associated with it. We'll talk about those in the health section. But it also exposes us to maybe some irrational behavior, less logical behavior, more susceptibility to scams and things like that. So that's why cognitive decline risk has its own category here. Number 10, behavior risk. Will you get in your own way and make irrational decisions? Will you let fear or greed or following the herd guide your decisions to your own detriment? That's behavior risk. That's number 10. Number 11, I call assumptions risk. It's an interesting one that sits kind of underneath a lot of the other risks. It's that overly optimistic return assumptions, or underestimating inflation, or ignoring taxes, or assuming a static spending rate over time. It's the risk that our model itself, our retirement model, is wrong. That's assumptions risk, number 11, and it's pretty prevalent among the DIYer community, I've got to say. Number 12, policy, legislation, and tax risk. So think about tax rates, interest rates, Social Security policy, which I know is a really hot topic for those people who are worried about if Social Security will somehow change in a big way over their retirement. RMDs is another big one, estate taxes. There are a lot of vital inputs to retirement that are frankly out of your hands. They involve the government in some way. So what can you do to kind of mitigate your risk in these situations? That's number 12, policy, legislation, and tax risk. Number 13, I call identity and purpose risk.
If I can't scuba, then what's this all been about? What am I working toward?
Creed from The Office. So forget about finances. What about your life excites you? Is there any chance that you're going to find yourself with this mid-retirement crisis because you're not sure what it's all about for you? There's an interesting stat. I'm going to steal it real quickly from Fritz Gilbert. I think it's that 28% of retirees at some point self-describe their feelings as depressive in some way. Maybe they don't have full-fledged depression like a psychiatrist would diagnose, but they actually feel kind of this melancholy about their retirement. So that presents identity and purpose risk, number 13 today. And that brings us to number 14, perhaps the most unique one that I've added to this list. It's called the deep risks. Deep risk is a term coined by Bill Bernstein, very famous investing writer, and it covers 4 massive risks to long-term investing. Inflation is the most common deep risk and deserves its own call out, which we've already done here. But the other 3 are what I'm going to talk about here with number 14. The other 3 deep risks are deflation, confiscation, and devastation. And I'll explain those all in detail when we get to number 14. And the question here is, how will your retirement fare in the face of one of those socio-political deep risks? So those are my 14 risks. And today I'm going to deep dive into the first 7 of those 14, and we'll finish the list next week on episode 141. So let's work through the first 7 risks to consider the ways we could mitigate and combat those risks. And as we step through this exercise today and next episode, here's what I would encourage you to do. I do not think you need to take what I'm about to say as some sort of dire warning that you must change your ways. I don't want you to hear these 14 risks and these 14 sets of solutions and think to yourself, oh my God, I'm at risk and I have to immediately act. Because our financial plans, our retirement plans, we should measure them in decades. They are these kind of metaphorical aircraft carriers, right, that are slow to gain momentum, slow to change direction, slow to do just about everything, but yet also very powerful over the long run. And so for just about every aspect of our financial plans, we can and should take our time with these decisions. And these risks that I talk about today and the responses are something that perhaps you should take under consideration, you should think about, but I don't want you to think that there's some sort of burning fire that you must address today. So with that preamble, let's discuss our first risk, longevity risk. Again, to me, the biggest, most obvious retirement risk that I can think of, it's the risk that you live so long for one reason or another that you run out of money, that you built a retirement plan assuming you'd live until age 75, but then you end up living to age 95. Now, the real nasty part about longevity risk is that it's a risk magnifier. It's not just about how long you live. It's really about how that extra decade or extra 2 decades of life interact with many of the other risks that we've talked about today. Inflation, market volatility, healthcare costs, changing spending patterns, etc. So longevity can sometimes magnify your exposure to the other risks. Nevertheless, let's talk about some of the smartest financial planning strategies to mitigate and combat longevity risk specifically. So here in the USA, every retiree, at least every retiree who's worked at least 10 years contributing into the Social Security system, every retiree has Social Security available to them. And every retiree who has that Social Security available to them can choose to delay Social Security to age 70. That is, in my opinion, the biggest single way to combat longevity risk. For a quick numerical example to explain that, let's compare someone who claims Social Security at age 62 versus 67 versus 70. And then let's think about longevity. So if we're talking about longevity risk, we should probably think about someone who lives a long time. So for this example, they'll live to age 90. Now, using typical Social Security benefits, for those of you listening right now, a normal average scenario would see someone claiming at age 62, they might collect $610,000 between age 62 and age 90. If they delay that same person based on that benefit size, if they delay Social Security until age 67, they would collect $720,000 by age 90. And if they delay claiming until age 70, they would collect $780,000 by age 90. Now, so that's, between the worst case, collecting at age 62, and the best case, collecting at age 70, that was a $170,000 difference in how much they collected over those years. And if this person lives to age 100, the total difference in benefits between the two claiming strategies could easily surpass $300,000. Now, it's guaranteed income from Social Security. It's a fantastic tool for longevity insurance for most retirees. But what else could we do? Well, we can also build growth and inflation protection into the assets that we own. Now, the problem with that particular answer is that growth and inflation protection aren't ever truly guaranteed. It's never like a silver bullet. The assets I'm talking about here, for example, would be stocks. Stocks have a great kind of growth engine built into them that, if you're diversified enough, should kind of float on the rising tide of inflation over time. That's the way that stocks behave. Real estate, the same way. TIPS, which are Treasury inflation-protected securities, have a small measure of inflation protection built into the products themselves. And history would tell us that these assets hold up well over the long run, even in the face of inflation. And to me, most of the time, that's kind of the best that we can do. We use history to guide us into the future, but that's not quite a guarantee, at least not in the same way that Social Security benefits are a guarantee. You could choose to also look at simple annuities here, something like a SPIA, a single premium immediate annuity, or some retirees also like using a MYGA, a multi-year guaranteed annuity, similar to a SPIA, but usually only lasts up to 10 years. Now, on episode 131, I recorded a deep dive on annuities, including why most annuities in this world, I think, are not good for investors like us. But I also admitted in that episode that there are some annuities, including SPIAs, including MYGAs, that at the very least I would classify as acceptable. I don't know if I'll ever recommend one, but I'd understand if someone chose to buy one. And the reason is that SPIAs especially provide longevity insurance. They provide guaranteed income for life. Now, most of us will die early enough such that the SPIA math does not work in our favor, but some of us will live long enough to see the SPIA fundamentally improve our retirement finances. That's how insurance products work, right? Most of us buy insurance and we don't get as much money out of it as we put in. It's a losing deal for us. But for some people, insurance is a winning deal. It saves their lives in some way. And annuities are that. What are they insurance against? Longevity risk. Annuities are longevity insurance. Now, as for the rest of what we can do to combat longevity risk, it really involves talking about some of the other risks. It talks about battling inflation, battling sequence of returns, choosing spending and withdrawal flexibility, building protection for long-term care costs. But if there's one major risk I think most retirees should focus on, it's longevity risk. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I send a free weekly email to thousands of readers that shares 2 simple things, just 2. The first are my new articles and podcasts, so you'll never miss when I publish new content. And the second is my favorite financial content from other corners of the internet, so you can see what's been helping me the most.
But Jesse, I don't want another email.
I hear you. I make this newsletter short, sweet, and full of essential information, and readers enjoy that. About 85% of newsletter subscribers are engaging with the newsletter more than once a month. They're enjoying it, and you will too. You can subscribe for free on the homepage at bestinterest.blog, and you'll get a free PDF of my white paper titled The Step-by-Step Guide to Building Your Retirement Paycheck. That's right, a free weekly email that thousands of people like you are already reading, a free white paper to help you plan for retirement, and you can sign up for free at bestinterest.blog. And that brings us to our second risk, inflation risk. It's the second one I want to talk about. Inflation, again, is this ever-present phenomena in modern economies, meaning today's dollar will lose spending power over time. And combined with living longer than expected, inflation risk means our current dollars simply won't go far enough into the future to meet our needs. Now, the number one tactic, I think, to combat inflation risk is to own assets that traditionally outpace inflation and minimize your exposure to assets that get decimated by inflation. Bonds and cash, for example, they get decimated by inflation. There's no sort of inflation adjustment built into cash and bonds. But with stocks and the companies that stocks represent, there's a natural pricing mechanism at play where the companies will slowly but surely increase their prices over time, increasing their revenues over time, meaning that your returns as a stock owner have this kind of tether to inflation rates. Think of it as a buoy that floats up and down with the tide. If inflation rates are just going up, 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 the tide's going up, 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 stocks in general tend to rise with that rising tide. But that brings up this really amazing, interesting thing about stocks and bonds in particular. And the amazing thing is there's no perfect asset for our long-term needs. Stock returns cannot be relied upon in the short and medium term. We must use a more dependable, less volatile asset for those short-term cash outlays. Cash or bonds are a suitable choice for that. And we must accept the lower returns from those assets as a price to pay. And we also must accept that we might lose pace to inflation. We might lose some ground to inflation, I should say, at least over the short run, if we're holding cash and bonds to meet our short-term needs. That's just the price we pay. Nothing is free in the world of investing. For higher growth, the cost is more volatility. But for greater stability to meet our short-term needs, the price is less growth. And so cash and bonds help us fight sequence of returns risk, which we'll get to in a minute. Cash and bonds ensure our financial plan has this really strong foundation over the near term and the medium term years, but cash and bonds also expose us to inflation risk. So we need to find a balance between fighting inflation risk and then fighting sequence of returns risk and fighting market risk. And my point is that I've got 14 unique risks I'm talking about today, or between today and next episode, I should say. And some of the tools we use to fight risk A actually expose us more to risk B. And some of the tools we're going to use to fight risk C expose us more to risk D. And a big part of financial planning is finding that right balance where how do we, in general, kind of minimize our exposure across this broad spectrum of risks? How do we identify which of these specific risks we're kind of uniquely most exposed to in our situation? Anyway, that's why I think it's such a fun exercise. That said, stocks aren't necessarily the only asset that tends to be kind of inflation-proof over time. Real estate, infrastructure, commodities, generally these assets have some sort of income stream connected to inflation or simply go up in value with inflation, real estate, infrastructure, and commodities. But I do have some issues with these assets, I will say. So if you're owning individual real estate, you're subjecting yourself to a really big concentration risk and quite a bit of hassle usually. If you decide to own real estate through a REIT, a real estate investment trust, well, in that case, your investment risk actually looks a lot more like equity risk, like the stock market, than it looks like real estate. So that's not necessarily what you're going for. With commodities, you're not really owning an income-producing asset. I think the only economic argument for owning commodities is that you'll keep up with inflation itself, nothing more. Compared to stocks, I don't really like that trade-off. But at the same time, there are plenty of long-term investing ideas that include real estate, include commodities, include other alternatives, and they look good over historical backtests. So to each their own on this topic. The point is that inflation risk is a real threat in retirement, and you need to make sure that your financial plan combats that risk. And number 3 here, I want to touch on partner risk or household risk or stakeholder risk. And again, are you and your spouse, are you and your kids, are you and whomever, are you on the same page? And could some sort of disagreement or maybe an untimely death throw off your long-term plan, your retirement plan? I think about different ages, different lifespans, different spending habits, different levels of financial literacy, different priorities in life. This risk is much less about any sort of investment decision, but really mainly solely about communication and the financial plan itself. So first, You need to plan for both lifetimes, not just average outcomes. I think it's important that you need to plan out and model a scenario where maybe one spouse lives significantly longer than the other, especially important if there's an age gap, if there's a health difference. It ensures that the surviving partner doesn't run out of money later in life. And you also need to model out the widower scenario because what happens financially when one person dies. Some key things to evaluate could include a loss or reduction of income because pensions might cease to exist or might be diminished after the pensioner passes away. Social Security benefits can change a lot before and after a death. Changes in expenses are a major one, right? Some expenses might drop away when one partner dies, but some expenses don't go away at all. There's some pretty good stats out there that suggest that if the average married couple is spending 100%, then after the first partner dies, the surviving spouse is still probably spending somewhere between 60 and 70%. Because some expenses don't get cut in half when one partner dies. They remain the same. Tax filing status is a big one, right? Filing jointly is more efficient than filing single. And after the first spouse dies, I believe that the surviving spouse has a full year to file jointly still, but then they have to start filing single, and that's less efficient than filing jointly. So these kind of things, these issues are common points of failure, at least common points of inefficiency in otherwise solid financial plans. Next, I think it's important that both partners truly understand the plan. A classic risk is that one person runs everything, runs all the numbers, and the other partner says, yeah, well, I trust you. You're the finance person. You're the money person. But I don't like that. I think both partners at least ought to know where assets are held, how income is being generated, or really what I should say is kind of like how the retirement paycheck, so to speak, is being created, who to call for help. I don't think that both partners have to be deep experts. That's maybe unrealistic, but you don't want one partner to feel totally financially lost. Next, I think that every retiree couple should be on the same page about spending. What's essential spending? What's flexible spending? How might you adjust spending in bad market conditions? What does that cutback kind of look like? Because spending, as we'll get to in a few minutes, spending leads to withdrawal rates. Withdrawal rates are a slippery slope toward heightened retirement risk. There's some other, aspects of financial plans that are less have to do with numbers, more have to do with documentation that both partners ought to know. Updated wills and estate documents, powers of attorney, beneficiary designations, clear account titling. And then you might not want to always figure this out alone. Even if you are the most hardcore DIYer, your spouse might not be. So think about building some sort of circle of trusted advisors or at least trusted contacts, whether it's an estate attorney, a financial planner, an accountant, a trusted family member. The key is to have the surviving partner to have hopefully somebody in the loop who they already know and trust. There's a decent sized list. Maybe I'm a little surprised by how long the list is, but there's a decent sized list of listeners like you who have written to me with a perfectly nice email saying, Jesse, I'm a DIYer. I plan to be a DIYer until I die. But I told my spouse to call you when I die. Well, thank you very much. That's an honor. I will say at times it might be important to start those kind of conversations before death, just to establish a little bit of a trusting relationship and maybe get some ideas for improvement in place earlier rather than later. But the point is that you don't want to overexpose yourself or your family to this partner risk, household risk, stakeholder risk, whether it involves one person dying sooner than anticipated, whether it involves one person having all the information and the other person having none of the information, or maybe it just involves disagreements between how the two of you want to approach your spending, your investing, how you approach the money side of retirement. Partner risk is a really big one that you want to mitigate over the long run. Next up, number 4 on our list is market risk. In a very general sense, market risk is the idea that investments can go down in value, meaning that there's a risk that investments hurt you more than they actually help you. And market risk is, in a very kind of dictionary definition kind of way, it's a risk that you cannot diversify away entirely. Market risk is the price of admission for long-term investing. If you want the long-term returns that the market has to offer, you have to accept that sometimes those markets will fall. So the goal isn't to eliminate market risk. It's to survive market risk, to avoid being totally undone by market risk. And some of you might think, well, market risk, sure, this is why I diversify, isn't it? This is why I diversify my assets. And yes, you want to own thousands of stocks across different industries, geographies, market caps, etc. And that reduces the risk that any one company's failure will derail your plan, but you still face market risk. Even diversified stock portfolios drop by large amounts with, in my opinion, unsettling frequency. Diversification means that you avoided kind of additional unnecessary risks, but you cannot diversify away market risk. So to truly kind of defeat market risk, I think the first thing you need to realize is that time is your biggest ally. Time. If you need money in 2 years, the stock market is a dangerous place to be. But if you need money in 20 years, the stock market's volatility really becomes your friend. Market risk can be totally eliminated or very close to totally eliminated as long as you're not forced to sell your stocks at the worst times. I think you can and should rebalance to combat market risk. That's a big tool that you can use in your favor is rebalancing. I spoke about this in depth on episode 138. Generally, as the stock market rises, especially as it rises quickly, market risk increases. Rebalancing, though, forces you to sell what's gone up and buy what's gone down, thereby reducing your exposure to market risk. A dollar cost averaging helps combat market risk too. So whether you're in accumulation mode or decumulation mode, dollar cost averaging money in or out of the market helps diversify your market risk through time, diversifying through time. Over time, dollar cost averaging, it smooths out the various entry and exit points with money going in and out of your portfolio, and it decreases the likelihood that you'll need to sell or buy some big dollar amount of investments at the quote-unquote wrong time. And last, I would say that the pain of market risk is almost always, not always, but is almost always accompanied by bad investor behavior. And again, it's not that market risk itself has to be incorporated with bad behavior. It's that feeling the pain, actually recognizing the downside of market risk is almost always due to bad investor behavior. So that's selling during a panic, right? That's chasing performance. It's abandoning your predetermined plan. Plans and portfolios fail if the investor can't stick with them. So again, market risk. Market risk isn't a bug. It's a feature that creates returns. It's ever present. We all face it. If markets were stable and predictable, then returns would be lower, right? That's just the fact of how markets work. So market risk and then volatility, we want it really. And it's the cost that we pay for long-term growth. That's market risk. Here's a quick ad, and then we'll get back to the show. I love getting your questions, and some of you ask me questions about the wealth management firm I work for in Rochester, New York. Others ask about the Best Interest blog and this podcast, Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors, which operate without advertising, without pushy sales, and with no paywalls. How can the blog and podcast stay afloat without me dumping my own money into it? Well, to answer both those questions, I want to point you to episode 78 of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. I intentionally recorded episode 78 to shine light on those topics and inform you how you are actually helping and can continue helping these projects carry forward. So if you've ever been curious about the business of my blog and podcast, or if you're curious about my day job in wealth management, please check out episode 78 and let me know what you think. Next up, number 5 on our list here is sequence of returns risk, which is a particular type of market risk. So even if your investments go up over the long run, and even if market risk is something that you can easily tackle behaviorally, if your investments go down too early in your retirement, it can create this chain reaction that you never really recover from. So I'm going to borrow from what I discussed in episode 126, because I have discussed sequence of returns risk a bunch. We also did a deep dive on sequence risk back in episode 87. And I'll link another article in the show notes about the interaction between sequence risk and required minimum distributions, RMDs. For those unfamiliar, I think the one sentence definition of sequence risk is that bad market performance hurts you disproportionately more in the early years of retirement than in your later years, such that we all carry a risk that our retirement will suffer an unlucky streak of bad returns early on, potentially derailing our long-term retirement dreams. Yes, that was one run-on sentence. So let's talk about how much it matters, how sequence risk actually declines in time, and what you can do to protect those early years. So in Wade Pfau's book, Retirement Planning Guidebook, he attempts to quantify the magnitude of sequence risk year by year leading into retirement. And we'll throw a link to Wade Pfau's chart into the show notes. And my takeaway from the study is this. The first 6 years of retirement carry more sequence risk than any pre-retirement year. And Wade Pfau's study looked at a 60-year period, 30 years before the retirement date, 30 years after retirement, to evaluate each year's relative impact on final portfolio value. So again, the first 6 years of retirement carry this really significant sequence risk. And the first year carries the most risk by far, with each subsequent year falling off pretty significantly. And by the time you're at year 10 of retirement, your sequence risk is actually far lower than it was for the entire decade before you retired. Or put another way, if you're listening to this and you've been retired for more than 6 years, I'd feel pretty great about that. If you've been retired more than 10 years, you should feel really great about that. But going back to today's topic, thinking about this risk, the risk itself, and how do we mitigate this risk? What do we do about sequence risk? In my mind, it's actually pretty simple because, as I've mentioned before, sequence risk is not just a function of market returns. Of course, it is a function of market returns. It's also a function about how much money we withdraw when our assets are depressed. selling our assets when they're down 40% off their all-time high will cause a major sequence pain in our retirement plan. And that's why we want to build in some sort of safer or non-correlated assets into our retirement portfolio. In an ideal scenario, it might look like, well, it could look like a bunch of different things, but one example could be 6 to 12 months of pure cash, 2 to 3 years of short duration bonds, another 2 to 3 years of longer duration bonds. And when we zoom out, we see right there, 5, 6, 7 years of spending in cash and relatively low risk bonds. And that should get us through most of that really risky sequence window. And most retirement portfolios, or at least many retirement portfolios, already have this. So if you're entering retirement with, say, 30% or more of your portfolio in cash and bonds, 30% or more, you almost certainly have at least 6 years worth of spending right there in cash and bonds. Now, if you're entering retirement with 20% or 10% or barely anything in cash and bonds, well, then you might have to make a hard decision. Because on the one hand, if you own 100% stocks, let's say, you're not really that exposed to inflation risk, and good for you, but you're very exposed to sequence of returns risk. And this goes back to that trade-off I was talking about earlier. You've decided to combat risk A, but you're exposing yourself to risk B. So the question for you is, do you intentionally accept the lower expected returns of cash and bonds? Do you intentionally accept a little bit of additional risk exposure to inflation risk, but in order to dissipate your exposure to sequence risk? Financial planning is chock full of those types of trade-offs. And financial planning is also all about understanding and at least somewhat decreasing your range of potential outcomes. So here's a situation where if you're entering retirement with 100% stocks, I would wager that rebalancing a little bit to give yourself some way to combat sequence risk by adding some cash or bonds to your portfolio is usually going to be a beneficial trade-off for you. So those are my thoughts on sequence of returns risk and how we can combat it. Our next risk, number 6, is withdrawal risk. You're simply withdrawing too much money too quickly, which most of the time, I will say, is simply hidden language for you're spending too much money. Or it could be a hidden language for you didn't have enough money to retire in the first place. I don't really think that there's a big secret here when it comes to withdrawal risk. But as I said before, measuring your cash flow, right? Measuring the money that's coming into your life and going out of your life is a simple, low-hanging fruit that all of us can do. And yes, it can be a little tedious. It can be a little annoying. There's a reason why I should say some people find it challenging to measure their cash flow. Budgeting is a curse word to them. We're talking about the same thing here. But avoiding that exercise, avoiding the measurement of your cash flow can lead to big retirement issues. The solution for withdrawal risk is to stop withdrawing such large percentages of your portfolio every year. And one way to do this is by spending less. Another way to do it is by increasing the cash that's coming in the door, which might look like a part-time job. Another way to do it is by not retiring in the first place, choosing to work a few more years and actually adding more money to your portfolio by saving than taking money out by withdrawing it. And I realize that none of those solutions are too exciting. They aren't, right? If my answer to your problem is you got to spend less money, you got to get a part-time job, and actually now that I think about it, you shouldn't retire in the first place. Nobody wants to hear that news, but that's at times the simple reality and the simple arithmetic of certain financial situations. But withdrawal risk is a serious risk in retirement and one that, again, there aren't really any silver bullets against it. It's just some simple arithmetic about how do you take less money out of your portfolio on an annual basis, but it's certainly something you need to be aware of. And that brings us to the last risk, number 7 for today's episode, health risk. In a general sense, health risk. I think to myself, will you find yourself at 70 years old, too weak or too sick to hop on a plane, to play with your grandkids, or live whatever version of active retirement that you've been hoping for? I'm not even focusing on the possible expenses of health issues right here. I'm not even thinking about dying early right here, although those are both serious risks worth considering. I'm just thinking about pain and suffering. I'm thinking about the loss of lifestyle flexibility. Again, no longer able to sit in a car for 4 hours or pick up your grandbabies. There's nothing financial we can really do when your body betrays your wishes. That's kind of a scary thought. At least I think it is for me. I know nothing about health in any sort of real capacity. So what follows here is mostly me just parroting what other experts have to say or just kind of doing that anecdotal health talk that some of us tend to do. It does seem, from what I've read from some real experts who know what they're talking about, it does seem that the biggest weapon we have against health risk, because that's what we're here to talk about, the biggest weapon against health risk is to invest in your own health early and often. Simple things, exercise, nutrition, sleep, preventative care, they're more than just lifestyle choices. We can, and I think we should think of them as the pseudo financial strategy. Certainly something that aligns perfectly with the topics that we talk about on this podcast. In fact, episode 79 and episode 122, Dr. Phil Perlman stopped by to talk very specifically about the intersections of wealth and health. Now, what does it actually mean to invest in your health early and often? Which exercises are best? Which diet? How much sleep do you need? Those topics, I'm way out over my skis. I'm not going to pretend to prescribe to you good exercises, good diets, and how much sleep you need. But I think it's worth asking yourself about what exercises, what diet, and how much sleep you ought to be getting. There is something, though, that I go back to. I think of it as the 1,000-person test. It's very basic. Imagine we have two groups of 500 people each, so 1,000 people in total. Group A, those 500 people are what we'll call super healthy. Group B is what we'll call unhealthy. So Group A, they eat really well, they stay active, they get good sleep, they have positive relationships. Group B is just the opposite on every metric. And then I think, will there be some members of Group A, the healthy group, where they end up in a place where, surprisingly, they have some bad health outcome like cancer or dementia or heart disease? And the answer is probably. After all, 500 people is a lot of people, and some of them will have some bad outcomes. And then I think about Group B, and will some members of Group B end up in a place where, surprisingly, they actually have a good health outcome? They live until age 95 and they die of natural causes and everything is fine. Well, probably, because there's 500 of them and it's a lot of people. The law of large numbers, there are going to be some outliers. But if you measure outcomes across the entire group, I am willing to say, despite my total lack of medical expertise, that Group A is going to look way better, and we all are going to wish we could end up in Group A. So I think it reframes our question a little bit. It's not necessarily, how do I make sure I avoid a heart attack? How do I make sure I avoid dementia? I mean, of course, if there were, again, silver bullets, we probably ought to be taking those silver bullets. But I'm not sure there are. I think, therefore, the question that at least I ask myself is, what would a person do to end up in Group A? And when should that person start working toward ending up in Group A? And as I've moved through life and interacted with more and more people in their 60s and 70s and 80s, I just find it so fascinating that some people, they haven't even claimed their Social Security yet. That's how young they are. But you can see their labored movements or their fatigue, their loss of independence, their cognitive fog. And that's a little heartbreaking. And then there are people who are 85. They're still moving around well. They've got presence and posture and mental acuity and sharpness. And that's amazing to see. And so while we're here talking about finances, ask yourself, would you rather have an A+ financial plan combined with a D on physical health? Is that something you want? Or if you had to refocus some of your time and energy and resources, would you rather be willing to dial down your finances to a B+ if it meant bringing your health up to a B+? Now, obviously, this isn't a game where we simply get to dial our attributes up and down, but my point is that retirement is about more than just finances. Health risk, which, yes, is a cousin of longevity risk to be sure, it should be one of the more important risks that you choose to steel yourself against. Your 3% withdrawal rate means very, very little if you're dead at 68 years old, or even if you're just kind of semi-incapacitated at 68 years old. Wealth without health, I think, loses a lot of its luster. Again, wealth without health loses a lot of its luster. And we need to ensure that we're doing what we can to minimize that health risk. So thank you for listening. I'm going to pause here today, and I'll continue in our next episode covering long-term care risks, cognitive decline risk, behavioral risk, assumptions risk, policy, legislation, and tax risk, identity and purpose risk, and then the so-called deep risks. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. If you have a question for Jesse to answer on a future episode, send him an email over at his blog, The Best Interest. His email address is jesse@bestinterest.blog. Again, that's jesse@bestinterest.blog. Did you enjoy the show? Subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. This helps others find the show and invest in knowledge themselves. And we really appreciate it. We'll catch you on the next episode of Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors. Personal Finance for Long-Term Investors is a personal podcast meant for education and entertainment. It should not be taken as financial advice, and it's not prescriptive of your financial situation.